Hey guys, how we doing today? It's a rainy Saturday morning, nice and cool. Soft rain, not a storm. We've been getting a lot of crazy weather. Climate deniers be damned. Shit's not like it used to be. Thunder doesn't walk down the street anymore. Like it comes with lightning. It's just nuts. Some of the things that we're seeing, but I'm not gonna go down that road right now. But hope you all been enjoying the Legacy series stuff. Today we're gonna do something a little bit different. Today we're gonna talk about the great Blue Note label, and we're gonna kind of do something a bit Blue Note for beginners. And what's the hype? What's the deal? What's it all about? And we're not gonna go too in depth on some of the specifics. We're gonna talk more about the artists that I think you should be aware of. And a lot of you are going to be pretty well versed in Blue Note if you've been collecting jazz for any length of time. The Blue Note horizon quickly dawns. It's something that you realize had a lot of impact and had a lot of marketability still today. It's definitely inflated in the present in terms of its importance and its place in the jazz canon. It's been elevated by its collectability, its great artwork, the great artists that were on it. It's just kind of become a niche thing that's separated from its contemporaries in terms of its collectability. Like I said, the artwork plays a big part of that. The numbered little sequences on there, it just sucks you in. But there's more to it than that. And again, we've talked about the power of Blue Note and what a lot of it represents, the angry young militancy of young black men. And that's a huge part of its legacy, but that's the less tangible part of it. That's the part that fewer people can put a thumb on or recognize or be aware of. It takes a certain degree of historical context and empathy for those revelations to make any sense. And I think for a lot of people, no, they don't collect Blue Note having any of that historical significance or impact in mind in any way, which is a shame, and I've tried to do something about that on this channel because I want people to recognize this isn't just music and intellect. These are declarations of independence. These are important documentations of historical happenings, and that's an absolutely important ramification of what the music's really about. But this is more of a simpler approach. We're not going to talk that stuff today as much. And again, it's super important, but I feel like I've talked about it a lot. And again, I want people to know it. But today this is more for Blue Note for beginners. And the Blue Note story starts in the 30s. It actually starts with Hitler in a way. These two young Jewish boys are in Germany loving jazz music, and the Nazi party takes over. And being Jews, the writing's on the wall, and they come to New York. And Francis Wolff and Alfred Lion, the wolf and the lion, you can't really get a better mythological tandem than that, which is kind of a weird unspoken coolness about Blue Note, the wolf and the lion. Pretty dope. I mean, it wasn't like one of them was called Seagull and the other one was called Mosquito. They're called Wolf and Lion. And these guys really were entrepreneurs, but that was not their strength. Their strength wasn't business acumen. In fact, they probably made a lot of bad business choices based off putting the art first, which is another part of why their credibility level is so high today. Release after release is so fantastic. The bottom line, the money situation was never really considered when it came to the art or the compromising of the art. I've said this before, but there's no greatest hits on Blue Note during when Alfred Frank ran the label. There's no Christmas albums. There's no Jimmy Smith plays the music of Broadway. Like, they do some show tunes, but they're songs that these guys chose to do, not like we're doing a campy version of some musicals because we want to sell some records. It was never that short-sighted. It was never that impressed upon that we need to sell records. It was so legitimate. It was so had so much integrity. And like I said, every label has label samplers and repackaged records and greatest hits, and it just goes on and on what most labels are putting out. In the first 100 records, I think Emerson has 15 kind of compilation things that were just pieces to sell and to market other artists on the label. They were money-driven kind of things. Not business. It's probably smart business, because you look at the track of Emerson Mercury, they grew into a giant label rather quickly in the 50s. And by the time the 60s come along, Mercury is a big record label with plants in St. Louis and Chicago, hitting the whole country, distributed really well. Blue Note's scale is minuscule. For those of you who aren't familiar, these guys were selling 3,000, 5,000 copies of their records in the black neighborhoods. So they weren't distributed nationally by any means. They were pretty much an East Coast phenomenon, in mostly like the Harlems and black neighborhoods in the inner cities where these records were having any kind of success. They weren't well reviewed. They weren't this darling. They were very unknown. And like I said, the legend of Blue Note's 10 times bigger now than it is at the time it happens. I think that's it's kind of like Metallica a little bit. Metallica, we think of Master and Puppets and Ride the Lightning as these classics. Those records were unheralded. Those were underappreciated. They didn't sell very well. Thrash metal was this kind of beaten stepchild in the heavy metal world. They didn't know how to even brush their hair, let alone put on their eyeliners straight. And now Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning, we hear those songs at sporting events, making us think that those records sold like the Black Album did by Metallica, but they certainly didn't. They've done so, in hindsight, they've sold really well now. But at the time, those records were very niche and very underground, and a movement that was being covered in the magazines, but certainly wasn't something that most people were going to be into. And Blue Note is an interesting, auspicious beginnings. When they come across, Boogie Woogie's really starting to take shape. And Boogie Woogie's a development on the blues. It's up-tempo, it's bright, it's got 8 beats to the bar, it's got some really dynamic players happening. And 3 pianists in particular, 2 being from Chicago and 1 from Kansas City, really bring Boogie Woogie to the wider world's audience. And of course, out of Kansas City, you got the great Pete Johnson. And Pete Johnson was a fantastic player who was also a great accompanist to singers. And then you have the great Meadlux Lewis and the great Albert Ammons out of Chicago, who were childhood friends. And these two were friendly rivals, and they bring Boogie Woogie to this bigger. Harlem had stride piano, Chicago and the Midwest had this Boogie Woogie thing happening. And Boogie Woogie ends up influencing even Louis Jordan. And it's early touches of rhythm and blues, early rock and roll. Boogie Woogie's part of this transition, Tiny Bradshaw. But these pianists were integral parts of that. And Alfred was able to sign Meadlux Lewis and able to sign Albert Ammons. I think they even have a Pete Johnson session. And these 3 guys ended up all in New York at one point doing the great John Hammond's concert, From Spirituals to Swing. And the great John Hammond's a very important figure in the jazz world. He kind of scours the South looking for forgotten black talent, undiscovered black talent, helps recognize and brings to the limelight Billie Holiday, Count Basie, just a score of people. But he does this show at Carnegie Hall called From the Spirituals to Swing. And he has these 3 Boogie Woogie piano players, Pete Johnson, Albert Ammons, and Meadlux Lewis, perform. And that recognition for that genre, that music, that new sound, gives Alfred Lion the impetus to sign these guys. And it's kind of the real creation point for Blue Note, is the Boogie Woogie era of the late 30s and early 40s. And I think that history is very much ignored by today's collectors and populists. The early 78 era stuff's kind of overlooked. But Hammond's an important figure that deserves mention more often in the jazz conversation. He certainly was an integral part in preserving a lot of this music and this heritage. And again, that concert, the Carnegie Hall, It led to all of them getting work in New York at the Red Door and the Cafe Society. So all three of these guys would often share a stage and take turns or even battle each other. It was quite the time. And Alfred scored a bit of a coup getting me Lux Lewis and Albert Ammons. And of course, Albert Ammons is the father of the great Gene Ammons. So these bloodlines run deep and rich in jazz. So these three Boogie Woogie guys are kind of a real score. Blue Note kind of launches. They're doing 78 era material. One of their other early things they do is license a lot of Sidney Bechet stuff. And I'm not positive on this, but I don't think they actually record Sidney Bechet. I think most of it's licensed from Europe. He's over there playing in Paris, doing concerts at Olympia Hall and all these places. And some of that stuff's being put out on Vogue over there and other different labels in Paris and France. And Sidney Bechet was a huge star going back to the 20s. He spent a long time in Europe at that point. And Alfred and Frank realized that adding Bechet's material to the Blue Note canon probably would be a good thing. So he's kind of the next guy in the fold. And a lot of the stuff comes out again in the 5000 series on the 10-inch era. So from the Boogie Woogie stuff to the New Orleans sounding stuff like Sidney Bechet, these are the first 12 guys that you need to kind of know from this era. Sidney Bechet, again, very much New Orleans, the clarinetist, fiery improviser, one of the great soloists of all time. The three great Boogie Woogie piano players, Meade Lux Lewis, Albert Ammons, and Pete Johnson, all are essential if you really want to understand the story of Blue Note. George Lewis was a fine clarinetist. He wasn't the greatest soloist from what people say. He was just a great band leader and a storyteller, and he really spoke to people. And he was quite popular in the New Orleans revival in the 50s and 60s. So he was a big signing for them. Sidney de Paris, another New Orleans tradition guy who's from Indiana, but he played that New Orleans Dixieland music brilliantly. And then Jsp Johnson was another guy that gets some recordings of. And Jsp Johnson's more from that Harlem stride school, a fantastic, eloquent, elegant pianist who I hear Hank Jones at times in Jsp Johnson. Of course, Jsp Johnson in Hank Jones would be the correct way to say that. Jsp Johnson is, of course, along with Fats Waller and Willie the Lion Smith, kind of these Harlem stride guys that are doing their thing in the 20s. And then Art Tatum fits in that mix somewhere too, who's out of Toledo. Art Tatum was the greatest improviser and virtuoso possibly ever. Art Tatum's a bad motherfucker. Tatum can do these long piano things up and down the keyboard. He can play solid groove and pattern, but then just throw in the stuff that sounds like an extra set of hands was all of a sudden sitting there. I mean, Octopus is what they should have called him. Tal Farlow was called Octopus because of his big fingers, but there was nobody like Art Tatum. And Tatum was a big influence on Parker. When Parker first went to New York, he was doing dishes in a place where Tatum was playing. And Tatum's kind of, in a way, dabbling in bebop with some of how he's approaching his scales and solos and what he's playing. Completely free of the limitations of the chords. Tatum was just a dynamic guy. So Jsp Johnson was another important player, more from the past, but still was a great thing for a young little label for a couple of German immigrants to sign these guys. Jsp Johnson records probably sold okay in Germany in the 20s. So those 8 guys are kind of this New Orleans piano boogie woogie tradition. And then there's 4 transition guys here I want to talk about. Well, first of all, I got to mention Gil Mel. Gil Mel's number 8 on this list. And Gil Mel is like this transitional modernist who has some composition mixed in with his improvisation. He is a precursor to a lot of other things. He plays baritone, he plays alto at times, I think he plays the flute at times. Gil Mel makes 4 10-inches, I think, in the early 50s, plus a really fine LP. And then he goes to Prestige and makes some great records as well. And the Prestige stuff tends to be a little bit more, actually, rhythm and blues, R&B, jazz, more straight ahead, modern stuff. But some of his stuff can be really, he ends up in the film industry with really some avant-garde, weird, spacey stuff. Creative player, but he's really one of the true last white musicians to record for Blue Note, Gil Mel. And that's another interesting about Blue Note, how black-centric the Blue Note message ends up becoming. So after those 7 New Orleans piano guys, plus Gil Mel, who's an important person, and probably the first guy at Blue Note that modern collectors are kind of trying to find. And most of it's, all of it's been reissued in Japan. But some of that Gil Mel stuff's pretty expensive and pretty tough to come by. There's 4 piano players now that are transitional players at Blue Note in the late 40s, early 50s. Of course, we're talking about Bud Powell, Thelonious Monk, Elmo Hope, and Herbie Nichols. All 4 of them are New York contemporaries. They all live and were raised and born in New York. They all spent time being influenced by each other, developing with each other, trying to outdo each other. You hear elements and sides of all of them in each other. Herbie Nichols, I believe, was a Trinidadian or Jamaican descent. His parents were immigrants. Bud Powell was a genius who was part of the early days of bebop and brings bebop to the piano and changes the world of the piano and the modern approach to it. Monk was the minimalist who reduced the ingredients down to their bare essentials and dropped in the essential chords and angles and blocks to give almost this Picasso-esque type playing. Monk was brilliant. And Elmo Hope kind of brings a bit of all that stuff together and was a great composer and arranger as well. So these 4 guys were all kind of these transition points where jazz is going from what it was coming out of the swing era into this new modern Pandora's box of openness that we can try almost anything now going into the 50s. And so those 4 guys are all essential Blue Note artists. And they're not long for Blue Note, but Monk especially. Monk changes the direction of the labels he's on. Make no mistake about that. Monk, recording for Blue Note in 50-51, he opens minds at Blue Note. And he, of course, leaves for Prestige, where he changes things at Prestige. And then he goes to Riverside, and they launch their modern sequence. Number 200 is the release of the first Monk record on Riverside. That changes their course completely. Monk is that fundamental and essential, and he's one of the founding fathers of jazz on Mount Rushmore in my mind, along with Parker, Ellington, and Armstrong. Monk is so instrumental. And so Bud Powell, again, just a huge giant of the music. So those 4 pianists, really, if you want to get to know Blue Note, these are important foundational pieces that really launch us into the next era. Meanwhile, in the early 50s, a young trumpet player named Clifford Brown is just shaking down the foundations. He's blowing through the doors of convention. He's playing melodic, well-shaped, well-rounded, hugely hummable lines that were acrobatic. Just a brilliant player that is incomparable. Only Freddie Hubbard, in my mind, really can play the dynamic, clean tonality of Clifford Brown and never lose the shape of a note. Like, Miles has a lot of notes that kind of sag and droop and drip and bend and blur. Brown's enunciation was this clarity, this clean tone filled with light and energy and love. There's a lot of love in Clifford Brown. Miles' resentment, you can feel that tension in Miles. Clifford Brown's like, let's make the world a better place. You can just feel it coming out of his horn. He's working with the young Max Roach. They're changing the sound of jazz, reshaping bebop, and hard bop's kind of coming out of this nucleus. Miles Davis kind of grafts it with his group at Prestige with Coltrane and, of course, Kelly and Chambers and who am I missing? Philly Joe Jones, that great quintet. But Blue Note's starting to see these changes happen. And one of the things that Blue Note does really well, and no other label can really say this, is they really don't chase after the legends of the music. Bud Powell was kind of an established name that they gave some play to. Of course, Powell comes and leaves. So in his early days, Powell was still fairly unknown. He returns later when he's more of a shell of himself after spending time in institutions and being beaten by police into madness. The Bud Powell story is one of the saddest stories you'll ever read this side of Hank Williams. You know, it's just a tragic, tragic story of abuse and American tragedy. Just a tragedy is what it is. But this new hard bop sound's coming on the scene, and Blue Note makes a decision somewhere in 54, 55. They almost sold to Atlantic because the 10-inch era was already being eclipsed by the new LP 12-inch era. I meant a whole nother round of it costs. Changing from 78s to 10 inches was costly. These new 10 inches have jackets with photographs and artwork and new printing costs. And the new 10-inch, it was all expensive changing of these 10-inch records. But the 10-inch record only lasts 50 to 54, 55. And now the 12-inch is coming out and it's changing the industry. And now the 10 inches are old stock and yesterday's news. And Blue Note almost sells to Atlantic, which, God forbid, we can't imagine Blue Note having been sold at this point. Because in 54, 55, none of the classic Blue Note canon, aside from maybe those Monk and Powell sides, have been recorded. None of it. So Blue Note would have been sold before really Blue Note happened to be Blue Note. But thank goodness they didn't sell. They took the risk and went into the 12-inch era. And again, Blue Note doesn't do this until 55. And by that time, Columbia and RCA and Decca, some of the big labels, have already been putting out the 12-inch album for a couple of years. I think some of the first 12-inch albums start showing up in the early 50s. And so when you go to the record store, if you want to be hip and modern, you got to buy that new technology. And so these little small indie labels, that took a while to use up their back stock of 10 inches. We can't just switch over and throw all that old material away. We got to use that stuff up. Then maybe we can switch then. And so it leaves them kind of behind the 8 ball. So Blue Note makes this transition into the LP. And the LP is a bigger, broader format. It changes how recordings are done. Instead of the 78 era, where we went and we tracked 2 songs, maybe 4, and you got a couple sides out of that for some 78s, you start doing sessions now more in 1 or 2 parts for 6, 7, 8 songs for an LP with that 30, 40, 50-minute length. And it changes how records sounded. A lot of 10 inches even were compilations of 78s. So you had different assignment on all these different tracks, recorded in different studios, but they were being compiled together in this new format. The LP brings about this new recording session where these 5, 6 guys are going to be in this room together for a couple days, maybe a week. We're going to rehearse. It just changes the unity, the focal focus of these guys. And I think that's an important part in the development of what happens at Blue Note. We're going into the civil rights era. The streets are shaking and vibrating with all the tension in America. And Blue Note decides to do something really risky. It decides to document that. Something that a Decca or a Capitol wouldn't have dreamt of touching. The young black militancy of the early mid-50s. Blue Note says, you guys, man, we left Germany because of this kind of shit. Say what you got to say. And the Blue Note cats come in there, and I just think Alfred and Frank, they only responded to what they felt. So that's got to link somehow to the fact that they're only started recording black musicians at this point. Because there was a desperation and a hunger and a fear and a resistance to tyranny that was speaking through a loudspeaker to these 2 young German Jews. We're like, oh my God, yes, that's it. And they could feel that resistance. That's why they came to America in the first place, only to find it here in America. And of course, being Jews, you were plenty much outsider in America still as well, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even today in some circles. But the black situation in America was so tenuous and so strained. Riots were happening. There was no employment. There was just drugs in the neighborhood. A lot of awful things were surrounding these young black men. A lot of them came back from serving in the war or the military to no freedom. I fought for freedom to still not have any freedom. And Frank and Alfred just soaked it up. And they just put on a loudspeaker this black expression of freedom, which is nothing more American than that. So what we have is this hard bop movement at Blue Note. And the 12 guys I'm going to list off to you right now are essential Blue Note sound artists. And Miles Davis, who recorded briefly in the early 50s, is not an essential Blue Note guy. Coltrane makes one record that's a very momentous piece, but it was really more part of a string of records that was this hard bop genius. And he does some side work as well, a few things in like 57, 58, but he's not really a Blue Note guy either. So neither of those guys are part of this list. And the most important Blue Note cat of all is probably Bart Blakey, the great thunderous drummer who throws down that fire, took what Max and Clifford Brown were doing, and just escalates the intensity even. And he finds the most vicious young black men to record with him and get that fire and that tempo and that, get into your horn and speak it. And he would kick you in the shins if you weren't throwing down hard enough. He was a pretty vicious taskmaster in some ways. He was a bad drug habit as well. He got a lot of cats into heroin apparently. But Bart Blakey's just a giant of this music. And he's as responsible for the Blue Note cliche sound as any guy on the Blue Note canon. So Bart Blakey's an essential. And his 50s work, there's a lot of kind of live stuff. And his real session album after album of great material really doesn't start till Moan in 59, 60. And then the Jazz Messengers go into the 60s making strings of just incredible records that dabbled in hard bop, hints of the avant-garde at times, but it was mostly straightforward, hard driving blues and modern hard bop. And those records are essential to understanding what Blue Note's about. Horace Silver was initially the pianist in the Jazz Messengers. He's a very important part of the Blue Note story. And they split ways in part because of Blakey's drug habit. And Silver creates his own band, and he makes a string of records at Blue Note for 20 years that are some of the most important records and most Blue Note sounding records. If you want to have a great idea of Blue Note, Horace Silver and Bart Blakey will give you both sides. Horace Silver's a little bit more rounder, a little bit more melodic, a little bit more contemplative, a little easier to digest, a little less blistering in tempo. And Blakey's the opposite of all those things with all the aggression and rough edges you could imagine at times. So Silver's super important. Then you get the soloists of the hard bop era at Blue Note, which include Lee Morgan, one of the most fantastic trumpet players of this era. His first 6 Blue Notes in the late 50s are landmark recordings of what the Blue Note sound is. And he, of course, leaves for a while, and then he comes back to Blue Note in 62, 63, and he continues to make important records, although they're different sounding records at that point. The great Hank Mobley is one of my favorite players, just a brilliant storyteller, a soft, round tone. He's the chameleon of the bunch who can graft his sound into any of the other Blue Note canon players. Donald Byrd was one of the initial Jazz Messengers in 55, when they actually recorded on Columbia, believe it or not. And Byrd leaves with Silver and Doug Watkins, and he's initially in Silver's group. Then he goes his own way, records a few things for Transition, and then ends up back at Blue Note in 58, 59, where he starts making records as a leader there. And Byrd's with the label for 20 years as well. And Donald Byrd's records are wonderful parts of the Blue Note canon and essential. You have Sonny Rollins, who's there for 4 records or so, 56, 57. And Rollins' best, most focused, most aggressive. To me, it's Rollins you don't get really anywhere else. Rollins on contemporary, Rollins on his later stuff in the 70s, Rollins stuff on RCA, Rollins stuff at Prestige. There's a lot of Riverside. His Riverside stuff's pretty solid. But his Blue Note work is so intense. It's so focused. He just sounds like someone stepped on his toe before he put his horn to his mouth. So Rollins is in a really focused place, which for Rollins was very important. Then there's the great Sonny Clark, who was one of the most unheralded people of the Blue Note story. But he was the pianist on almost all the great hard bop sessions. And he's the one that's really, if it's not a Jazz Messenger session with Bobby Timmons or whoever on the piano, if it's not a Horace Silver session, if it's a hard bop session at Blue Note, chances are Sonny Clark was the guy playing. And he just has this focused aggression, And there's a real spiritual, political slant to how his records always feel and sound. I'm a huge Sonny Clark guy, and a lot of what Tone Poet's putting out now are shelled Blue Note sessions that are very strung out. Sonny Clark was always leading. So Clark's legacy is actually growing right now because of what Tone Poet has been reissuing. There's the great Freddie Hubbard, who might be the last hard bopper to come along. The hard bop thing doesn't last for very long. It's really 55, 56 is kind of in its genesis. And by 59, 60, hard bop's kind of transitioning away from that fast up-tempo aggression and more modernity, more composition, more avant-garde, free jazz is all starting to reshape the sound of jazz and change the purity of what the hard bop movement was. Hubbard comes along, though, and as a young boy in, 59, 60, and he's just spitting fire. And he's the torch holder for the Clifford Brown virtuosity and just that viscosity of animation. He's such a fantastic player, Hubbard. Then you got to talk about Curtis Fuller, the great Detroit trombonist. The trombone goes into a great decline into the 60s, and it's much more of a swing era instrument that talks, and you can mute it and you make a lot of sweet sounds with the trombone, but doesn't really fit in with the aggressiveness of what a lot of the hard bop, bebop era was about. And also, you're playing at high tempos in hard bop and bebop for that matter. So it took real brilliant players like Jsp Johnson and Curtis Fuller to play hard bop on the trombone. And Fuller's a very dexterous player. He's just throwing that, what do you call it? Not the plunger, the whatever. He's doing the thing. Fuller's a bad boy. And he makes 3 or 4 records as a leader at Blue Note. And he's on a lot of the great Blue Note sessions as well. And he ends up joining the Jazz Messengers in the 60s. And he's a part of that group off and on for quite a while. So Fuller's an important player in this part of the Blue Note story. Kenny Doram, he's not always a hard bop player, but he certainly was part of some great hard bop sessions. He'd be higher on this list if he made more records at Blue Note. But he does some early work in 54, 55, leaves for a while, comes back in the early 60s, comes back again like in 64. So he's kind of in and out of the Blue Note canon, out of the Blue Note stable. And he makes great records elsewhere as well. Doram's a very important part of the scene. He's just less important on Blue Note because of all the work he does elsewhere. Johnny Griffin, he only does 3 records at Blue Note. He comes in from Chicago at 57, and one of the most ferocious tenor saxophonist you'll ever hear. Super fast, dexterous. He has a lot of what Clifford Brown has, but on the saxophone. Just a super dynamic roller coaster of a player that you really have to put your seatbelt on to keep up with what Johnny Griffin's going to throw at you. I mean, he'll leave spittle all over your face. He's a bad man. And then last year, again, not really a hard bopper, but Thad Jones, another Detroit guy, one of the Jones brothers, along with his brother Hank Jones on the piano and Elvin Jones on the drums. Thad Jones is a great trumpet player, a beautiful, clean sound. He worked with the basic groups for a long time, but he was very modern. He did a lot of composing and arranging for Basie. A lot of that went uncredited from my friend Jean-Michel told me. But Thad's a really, really brilliant and very important player that doesn't really fit the Blue Note template. He's too modern for the early stuff. And his small group composition Blue Note recordings are fantastic. They're not necessarily hard bop. They might touch on that at times, but they're more just most modern post-bop, brilliant stuff, though. I love Thad Jones records, and he had to be mentioned, so I put him here. And so that rounds out that section of late 50s hard bop. Now there's another group here, another 12 guys here we're talking about. So we have the old cats, the first 12, the hard bop cats, the second 12. The third dozen we're going to talk about is kind of the modern, into the soul jazz boogaloo players. And these players are equally important. And these were the players that actually kept the label afloat. So the hard bop guys in the 50s and so the avant-garde guys in the 60s could make their experimental records. These records were accessible, they sold well, comparably, and they were never sellouts. They were never cheesy, campy, light-hearted affairs that were just meant to be digestible. They were still filled with anguish and sorrow and hope and optimism and the entire language of the black experience. And some people diminish these records and these players somewhat, which is ludicrous. If you are a churchgoer, sometimes you want the pastor that's speaking, the reverend that's speaking, to be spitting hellfire and brimstone. And that's your hard bop guys. But sometimes you want a speaker that's going to speak more pastorally and more about heaven and the milk and honey and the pastures with the sheep grazing, gently buzzing in the summer dew. So there's room for both in the pulpit. And there's also room for both in the improvising of jazz. And we're going to go through this list quickly because we're already at 35 minutes. Jimmy Smith is the ultimate guy. And he made accessible stuff that sold well. He's also one of the great bebop improvisers in the history of this music. He played stuff that merged on the hard bop idiom with the up tempos and the aggression and the way they played some of those house party open sesame, some of those, not open sesame, a house party open house, is it? Some of those records are just fantastic that definitely have a lot of the blues and the hard bop in them. But Smith is one of the most important people at Blue Note. And people kind of almost mock his records, which is a shame. Especially his 50s stuff. He's as talented as any player to come along on any instrument ever. Jimmy Smith is a bad man. If you can get an old Jimmy Smith for $20, it's a record you'll never tire of listening to. I mean, if you open up your ears to it and really recognize how bad this man was and how much soul he really had, Jimmy Smith is the whole deal. Gene Harris and the Three Sounds, they are kind of the milk that you make the cereal with. Like the Three Sounds records are so fun. They're very accessible, but they're also very much blues driven. And they can take even poppier material and reduce it down to a real rhythm and blues, fun jazz experience. You gotta love the Three Sounds. Again, like Smith, you can find those records, original pressings for good money, for cheap money, because they sold well. And a lot of them haven't been reissued as much because they're out there still. So Three Sounds, Gene Harris, and Jimmy Smith records are absolutely important parts of the Blue Note story. And those records selling well is what allowed everything else to happen. You have Grant Green, who comes along in like 60, and he's one of the fantastic bebop style single note guitar players whose records sold again really well. He was probably the most recorded artist at Blue Note from 60 to 64 or so. He's either as a sideman or as a leader. He's just churning out material, and his records again are very accessible, very collectible, and more appreciated today than the Three Sounds or Jimmy Smith. But there's still people out there who don't love Grant Green, which good. That leaves them for people who do love Grant Green, I guess. I love Grant Green's work. Stanley Turrentine, the Pittsburgh native, is one of the great blues jazz soloists of all time. This guy's a storyteller. He's got the Baptist gospel in him. He just speaks it from the hip. He's not faking it. He's not pretending. He's not following trends. Stanley Turrentine is just speaking from his soul, giving you that sermon, the gospel of Stanley Turrentine. And he's such an honest player. So many other players you feel like are trying to either be competitive or live up to what's happening now. And Turrentine's always just riffing from the cuff. And his body of work at Blue Note is extensive. He really turns out a high level of material. And again, it's stuff somewhat overlooked by today's collectors, like the Smith, like the Three Sounds. They sold well, they're out there. So somehow people think they can't be good. The fact they sold well tells you they're pretty good. John Patton was an organ player, soul jazz guitar, trio, drums, guitar, organ. He kind of replaced Jimmy Smith, along with a few other organists like Freddie Roach and Babyface Willette when Jimmy Smith got signed away by Verve. You can never go wrong with the John Patton 60 records. They're really fun, solid records. Duke Pearson, very important name at the label, an A&R guy, a talent scout, a producer. He really helped shape and sound a lot of the sessions, especially in the 60s. You gotta love Duke Pearson. His early piano solo work, trio work, to me, some of the most beautiful records on Blue Note. And his later stuff actually really dabbles in very modern, into hints of avant-garde even. You know, he's a very creative player, Duke Pearson. He does some big band stuff, modern big band stuff that's really unique. Really, again, a huge part of the Blue Note story that's somewhat underappreciated. Kenny Burrell, one of the great guitar players in jazz history. His body of work is immense. 60, 70 records. I have 50, some of them. I love Burrell's sound. But if you're honest, his Blue Note output is not always his best work. From what I understand, he wasn't a big fan of the blue one. I can't think of what it's called right now. I think it's a great record, but Wavy Gravy's on it, I think, if I remember. But he was never a huge fan of that record from what John Michel told me, and he knew Kenny Burrell. And his early work, the one with the Andy Warhol cover, that stuff's kind of patched together from different sessions, so it's not a consistent, solid record like what a lot of the other records are. His live records are always great. I'm the hugest Burrell fan, but we're just talking about the Blue Note body of work, and it's probably not his best work. It's all great. I love it all, but again, he's one of those guys that kind of comes and leaves the label a few times, and a lot of his stuff is patched together from different sessions. The Blue Lights records are from different sessions, a lot of different players, so the albums don't have a real continuity to them. Still a great player, and I'm a huge Kenny Burrell guy. I listen, and he shows up as a sideman almost tirelessly. I would guess 1,000 sessions he's a sideman on. The number of times I've been listening to a record like, oh, I like that guitar work. I wonder who that is. I bet you it's Kenny Burrell. And it is. He's just omnipresent in music, even out of the poppier, lighter jazz, R&B, vocal jazz. He shows up in a lot of settings, Kenny Burrell. But his Blue Note stuff's definitely worth grabbing. It's just, I think actually it's a little overhyped. But that leads us on to Horus Parlan, a great modern piano player who had some polio in one of his hands, which affects his playing, but he's a very dexterous player. You can hardly notice it. He played with Mingus for a while. He ends up in Denmark, Copenhagen. I think he was actually out in the country in Denmark for the remainder of his life, and records over there for Steeplechase and other labels for a long time. But Parlan makes 7 records for Blue Note in the 60s that are fantastic records. I love all of them. And they range from trio stuff to kind of bigger group stuff. A lot of great players and sidemen show up with Parlan. A big part of the Blue Note story. Benny Green, a super important trombone player, more from the swing R&B sound of things, less like the Curtis Fuller, Jimmy Cleveland, Jsp Johnson dynamic. He's more of a lyrical player, plays the trombone more pre-bebop style. More crooning and singing and syrupy stuff. Real gospel to what Benny Green's about. Blue Mitchell. Again, Blue Mitchell's kind of at the bottom of this list because his best work is really with Horace Silver at Blue Note. And then as a solo artist, he gets signed by Riverside, where he makes 6 or 7 outstanding records in the early 60s. Then he comes back to Blue Note as a leader, probably 65 or so. And he makes 5 or 6 records at Blue Note then that are really solid records and real part of the Blue Note heritage, no question. You gotta love Blue Mitchell, a fantastic trumpet player. If you like Donald Byrd, if you like Lee Morgan, you like Kenny Doram, Blue Mitchell's in that same vein. And again, he was part of the hard bop scene with Horace Silver for a long time. A great storyteller. Big fan of him. And then there's 2 guys that are kind of throwbacks here that are kind of exceptions to what Blue Note does. You think about Verve and Prestige, how they got the Swingsville stuff, and Verve has all these old cats from the swing era. There's very little of that at Blue Note. Very little. Next to none. Ike Quebec was a guy from the 40s who ends up doing A&R work for the label for a long time, who he kind of convinces Alfred to give him another shot at recording. He ends up making a record called, I think it's Heavy Soul was the first one. Might as well be Spring, the Bossa Nova record. Those records by Ike Quebec are beautiful, Ben Webster-like tenor sax playing, beautiful ballads, wonderful syrupy storytelling. If you like a nice soft tenor, you can't go wrong with Ike Quebec's work. And of course, that leads us to Dexter Gordon, who I just talked about in the last episode. Dexter was, of course, from the bebop era on the West Coast, comes to Blue Note after serving some time in prison, and makes some great modern, very accessible records in Blue Note in the 60s. So that rounds out kind of the more mainstream soul jazz side of what Blue Note was doing. Now we're on to the last 12 here. We're going to go quickly because, again, we're at 44 minutes. Talking about the avant-garde. And I've had Blue Note's discography now for about 15 years. All 400. I'm almost up to 500 now with all the tone poets and stuff. But the entire 400 record sequence, I've had all that for a long time. So I've had a chance to really get to know this stuff. So I'm not like saying I listened to this the other day for the first time. This is what I think. I've heard the Blue Note canon a lot. Certain records a lot more than others. But I'm probably as well versed in the Blue Note canon as most people, anyone are. I know the whole thing pretty well. It's a huge body of work, but I understand its place and its time within the greater framework of the jazz kingdom and where Blue Note really excels and what it did great. I kind of really have choreographed the Blue Note dance pretty well. So the last 12 we're going to talk about here is the late avant-garde developments that happened to Blue Note. And the avant-garde free jazz starts taking shape in the late 50s. Even in the early mid-50s, guys like Jimmy Joffrey are kind of starting to shape some George Russell, some interesting stuff. Avant-garde starts taking shape. Charlie Mingus, he's a big part of this. But Blue Note kind of was always like, oh, it's not really what we want to do. And it's about 62, 63 where Blue Note starts diving into the modern sounds. And Coltrane's now at Impulse, kind of changing the sound, what white America is buying jazz-wise. Blue Note's again kind of on tough times. Lee Morgan's kind of came back and did Sidewinder, which is helping Blue Note stay afloat. But they still didn't compromise and allow some really interesting avant-garde records to be recorded that a lot of them didn't sell very well at all, which has made them very collectible today. And they're probably the most sought-after records by a lot of the Blue Note fanboys out there, in part because of the hype and the demand and the how expensive some of these are. Although early Mobley records can go for huge money. Early Morgan records, the same thing. But Grachan Moncourt, the great trombonist, whose father was a great jazz bass player, Grachan Moncourt II. Grachan Moncourt III was a fantastic player with all kinds of avant-garde and compositional ideologies. And his Evolution record is a brilliant record. It's one of the coolest avant-garde records in the history of the jazz kingdom. It's just a really fun, it's pretty accessible for as edgy as it is. And you can use it as a soundtrack to a noir film. And there'd be all the suspense and mystery and murdering moments that you would ever need. There's a heavy dew on that park bench and that fire escape. It's just really cool music that has some soundscape, soundtrack elements to it. Grachan, again, that record's pretty tough to come by. And he also shows up as a sideman. Some Herbie Hancock's this young pianist out of Chicago, just a fun, vibrant player whose compositions right out of the gate are getting recorded. His first record, I think he wrote 5 of the 6 tunes or something like that, 6 of the 7, 4 of the 6. I can't remember what it was. But he writes most of his own first record, which is pretty unheard of in jazz. And by his third record, Empyrean Isles, he's doing stuff like The Egg, which has really modern, post-industrial, like there's just weird loops happening and stuff that, again, it's all being done organically by these players, but it's something you would hear Jazz and Nova or DJ Shadow almost make some of it. It's really cool stuff. Wayne Shorter, of course, the jazz messenger, giant, was as strong a composer and arranger as anyone. He's still with us, as is Herbie. We love Wayne Shorter. Of course, Wayne and Herbie both played with Miles in that second quintet. But Shorter's a brilliant player, and during that time with Miles, he's still making his own records, a Blue Note, and he's a really innovative, leading the pack kind of guy. Shorter deserves a lot of recognition. Bobby Hutcherson's a great LA-based vibraphonist that starts to really challenge himself to take on edgier sounds for the vibraphone. The vibraphone never really dabbled too much into the avant-garde. It tended to end up more in lounge and Hawaiian sounding stuff. And Milt Jackson brought the blues to the vibes. Bobby Hutcherson brings the avant-garde to the vibraphone. And Hutcherson's a brilliant player. He works with Dolphy, again, a West Coast cat. Just, you got to love Bobby Hutcherson's work at Blue Note. And it's really kind of almost standard Blue Note avant-garde with some of what he does at that era. Andrew Hill, the great piano player out of Chicago, He's a great modern player. Really brings some interesting composition with Compulsion and Black Fire. A lot of the records he's putting out. He really becomes an important part of the Blue Note story. 64, 65, 66. I love Andrew Hill's records. They never go too far out, especially the early ones, but there's definitely that kind of hinting of modernity and composition taking its place in its role. Eric Dolphy only makes one record at Blue Note. I think he does a little bit of side work here and there, but he wasn't long for this world, sadly. Working with Mingus, he goes to Europe and passes away, sadly. But Dolphy was a brilliant player. He played bass clarinet. He played a lot of other instruments as well. Really interesting player. Dolphy, it'd have been interesting to see where his legacy went. He records Out to Lunch in 63, 64 for Blue Note, and it's such an interesting piece. It's something that collectors still clamor over today. And even though it's only that one record, he's definitely part of that Blue Note legacy from this era. Jackie Mclean, the fiery bebop altoist who was in Charlie Parker's image for a long time, always plays kind of bright and edgy and somewhat sharp, and even his hard bop era records are kind of hints of the avant-garde and the edges to him. So as the avant-garde comes along, it's a natural place for Jackie Mclean to kind of push himself into. And Mclean makes a lot of records, and Blue Note shelves quite a few of them, and which a lot of them came surfaced later. Mclean's kind of a guy you have to learn to love. Some of those records are much more accessible than others. Mclean's a very aggressive player at times, very creative player. His early work's very Charlie Parker-like, but by the 60s, he's really got his own sound. And you can almost recognize Jackie Mclean pretty quickly. Sam Rivers, another great tenor player who makes some pretty landmark recordings for Blue Note. He also ends up at Impulse, makes some good records at Impulse as well. Was clearly in the avant-garde free camp for a while. He worked with Miles Davis briefly, like in 61, but it wasn't a match made. I think that Live in Japan, Tokyo record is Sam Rivers with Miles. But Rivers is a brilliant player. Again, he has 3 or 4 records at Blue Note in 64, 65, 66 that are absolutely part of the avant-garde kingdom. The great Cecil Taylor, who I kind of talk a lot of shit about because I find Unit Structures to be the least listenable Blue Note record in the canon. I've always compared it to furniture being thrown down the stairs. And if you needed some music to help you throw your furniture down the stairs of your apartment building, Cecil Taylor's Unit Structures will be the perfect backdrop to throw mattresses and lamps and lazy boys down 3 flights of stairs. It's very cacophonic, and it's tough to get through both sides of that record for me, especially at this age. 20 years ago, I found it much more enjoyable. Don Cherry, who played with Ornette Coleman for the early Ornette Coleman classic period, he played the miniature trumpet. What's it called? Not the cornet, but it's anyway. He plays trumpet mostly, and he's a fiery player. He got a very brilliant player. His symphony for improvisers and a couple of other records he makes there at Blue Note at the end. Towards the end of Alan Frank's reign, he's kind of making some pretty edgy stuff. And then Larry Young, a great organ player, who starts off doing kind of soul jazz at Prestige, comes to Blue Note, makes a few records that are kind of accessible, but he ends up firmly in the avant-garde camp by the mid to late 60s. And then last on the list is the great Joe Henderson. And Henderson's a bit of a chameleon. He's a bit like Booker Irvin from Texas. He's a kind of a late comer on the scene. He's at the tail end of the hard bop era, so he's never really a hard bopper. He's definitely influenced by Coltrane, but he never goes as far out as Coltrane. And so what you have is a guy that is almost like a middle-of-the-road Coltrane. He's keeping it a little safer, a little bit more melodic, a little bit more Coltrane, Crescent, Coltrane, Live at Birdland era. Henderson's a beautiful player. He's capable of playing the most melodic, beautiful, lyrical stuff. He's also capable of playing some of the most outlandish, edgy, dissonant stuff when it calls for. He's a real chameleon in terms of the roles he can play, and he shows up in many different sounding Blue Note sessions. From Grant Green's Idle Moments to Jackie McLean. Like, he's just kind of a do-all kind of guy. And Henderson's really, he's got some Dexter Gordon in him. I like him when he's melodic, and I even like his edgier stuff because I think he's such a great, there's always a compromise with him. He's like, I'm going to push this out, but I'm not going to go too far. I don't really need to. You know what I mean? So Henderson never really loses me. And he's a hard guy to classify. He's not really part of the avant-garde camp, even though he shows up on a lot of those records. He's not really in the hard bop camp, even though he shows up on some of those records. He's not just a modernist. He's not just a soul jazz guy. He can kind of do it all. He's Stanley Turntine with more edge and more intensity, you know. But he can also be, like I said, the softest, most lyrical ballad player of all time. So what you just got there was 48 Blue Note names to remember. Blue Note for beginners. Those 4 eras of Blue Note tell the Blue Note story. That 40s, early 50s material, the 10-inch stuff, those 4 great pianists from New York, Powell, Monk, Elmo Hope, and Herbie Nichols, those 4 transitional artists, along with Gil Melle, who was kind of another transitional guy. The hard bop era with all its fire and fury and blackness, unapologetic blackness. The more soul jazz, easier to access, well, good selling Blue Note stuff that was happening. And then in the 60s, the more avant-garde stuff. And even the Blue Note avant-garde never goes out like Coltrane's Ascension, with the exception of maybe that Cecil Taylor record. It's pretty out there. But Blue Note always stayed fairly within the lines. And that's partly Alfred Lyon's doing. If he wasn't kind of feeling it in his little Jew-ass dancing over there, he wanted to hear it schwing, as the Blue Note players have reported. He said it needs to schwing, and I've seen some of the guys do Alfred Lyon's dance, and they knew when they were killing it because Alfred would break into that little dance, which I just think would be the cutest thing to see, this little Jewish guy getting it in. You know what I mean? Just shaking it down. You gotta love that whole Blue Note story. So that legacy, it's wrapped in all these great players, and it's not just about the commercial viability of the artists today and how valuable some of these records have become, and the tone poetry issues. There's a story that's much bigger happening in America that Blue Note documents, and so the cultural, the spiritual aspects of it, the social aspects of it, the musical edges of it. When Blue Note was truly being a leader, innovative, you know, with the hard bop stuff, the Blue Note story is an interesting story. But it's just a small part of the overall jazz story. Where Blue Note fits in the overall story, they really only peak and pinnacle kind of in a few places. And in the overall scheme of things, none of these Blue Note records really were huge successes, probably until Sidewinder. And Sidewinder had a 7-inch as well, if I remember, which probably helped push the sales of that in the jukeboxes. But even Sidewinder, Lee Morgan, I don't think sold 50,000. I doubt it sold that. It probably sold maybe 20, 30,000, which for Blue Note would have been incredible by that time, especially with the liquidity problems they were having. So again, they were always kind of peripheral. And what was happening at Impulse and Verve had 10 times more announcement on the stage. What was happening at Columbia and Decca RCA Capitol had far more exposure and made the Playboy magazines. And if you were playing with Stan Kenton and recording at Capitol, you were winning the Playboy jazz polls, the downbeat polls. If you were recording on Blue Note, you were obscure. You weren't winning polls. You weren't getting all kinds of publications speaking about you. You were a footnote that, oh yeah, this little label in New York put out a few records this month. Good stuff, Jimmy Smith. They might have reviewed it. And actually, something I've been curious to know, was there a black jazz publication in the 50s especially that was kind of jazz-centric, but looking at things more from the black side? Or were all the publications kind of equally promoting both black and white jazz? I know Downbeat was the big one, but oftentimes they'd have their own rag, their own magazine that might have shed different light and told different stories. And I don't know. I'm not a very big... I don't have a huge knowledge base on that, if I'm honest. So anyway, that's the Blue Note story. 48 names on Blue Note you need to know. And this will help people decide what's their Blue Note. What Blue Note do you love? Appreciate you all. If you love the channel, subscribe, thumbs up. If you want to support the channel, you can go to the Patreon page and pledge a few dollars a month. Always appreciate you guys who are doing so. Love you guys. Much, much, much love. And I'm just proud of what we've accomplished. We've created a nice jazz community where we talk about jazz. We're not talking about a lot of other things. We're not talking about, we're talking classic jazz most of the time. And I'm just thrilled there's as many people who want to follow it and watch it and talk about it and comment as there are. So thank you to all of you guys. There's a merchandise store in the description below if you want some gear, some hoodies, some coffee cups, whatever. That's always appreciated as well. Stay tuned to the channel. We got lots of stuff coming up down the pike. I've been excited with some of my new concepts and ideas I got coming. So appreciate you. We'll talk to you all soon. Peace.